Okay, so you want to own a car wash. Buy a strip of asphalt, put up a sign, and watch cars line up while the machine does the work. No employees to manage, no customers complaining about their food, just water, soap, and a steady stream of dirty cars turning into clean ones, and clean ones turning into cash. That's the picture in your head, and it's not a crazy one. Car washes look like the closest thing to a machine that prints money. Here's the problem. You're not picturing one business, you're picturing three completely different businesses that all happen to use the word car wash, and they don't compete with each other so much as they exist in separate financial universes. One of them just went from a $15 stock to a take-private buyout at $7 a share, weighed down by close to $800 million in debt. Another one can be run by a single owner working 10 hours a week. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly which one is which and what happens to your money in each. There are three main formats, and this video walks through all three side by side the same way at every step so you can see exactly where they overlap and exactly where they don't. The first is the self-service wash, the kind with a few open bays, a wand, a bucket of foam, and quarters or a card reader. You do the work yourself. The second is the in-bay automatic, the single stall machine you've seen at gas stations where you pull in, park, and the equipment moves around your car while you sit and wait. The third is the express tunnel, the conveyor belt wash where your car gets pulled through on a track past rollers, brushes, and dryers while you never touch a thing. We'll go through what each one costs to open, where it needs to sit, what eats the profit every month, how the math actually works out at the register, and what happens when the model breaks. Same order all three, so the differences do the talking. People think a car wash is a car wash, one business with one economic model and one path to the till. In reality, it's three separate asset classes wearing the same sign out front. A self-service wash is closer to a small piece of coin-operated real estate. An in-bay automatic is closer to a vending machine bolted to a gas station. An express tunnel is closer to a subscription software company that happens to spray water. Understanding which one you're actually looking at changes everything about the numbers that follow. Start with the self-service wash. A handful of open or covered bays, a pressure wand, a foaming brush, and a timer. Customers pay by the minute, usually somewhere around $3 to $8 for a full wash cycle. It needs the least land, the least staff, and the least capital of the three, and it survives almost entirely on low overhead rather than volume. Next is the in-bay automatic, sometimes called a rollover or a touchless bay. One car at a time drives into an enclosed stall, and equipment does the washing while the driver waits inside the vehicle. A single wash usually runs $8 to $20. It's the format most often bolted onto a gas station or convenience store because it needs almost no attendant labor and a relatively small footprint. Then there's the express tunnel, the exterior conveyor wash with multiple stations for foam, brushes, and dryers, usually staffed by a handful of attendants directing traffic. A single wash sells for around $15 to $30, but a growing majority of tunnel revenue doesn't come from single washes at all. It comes from unlimited monthly memberships, typically $20 to $40 a month, and that single fact changes the entire business model, which we'll come back to in the break-even section. One detail worth sitting with before the numbers start: at a well-run express tunnel, membership fees can end up covering more than half of total revenue, sometimes closer to 3/4, which means the person paying $25 a month and never actually showing up is, in a strange way, subsidizing the operation almost as much as the person who comes twice a week. We'll come back to that. Across the country, tunnels now account for roughly 28,000 locations and just over $10 billion of the industry's total revenue. In-bay automatics account for about 18,000 locations and $3.4 billion, and self-service accounts for about 12,000 locations and $1.8 billion, according to recent International Car Wash Association and IBIS World estimates. Three formats, three very different slices of a $17+ billion industry, and from here on, every number gets broken out for each one separately. The ownership pattern behind those numbers tells its own story. Self-service washes are still overwhelmingly owned by individuals or small local partnerships, the kind of asset someone buys alongside a day job and checks on twice a week. In-bay automatics split between individual owners and the gas station chains that host them. The tunnel is the one institutional money chased hardest, because it's the only format of the three built for the kind of scale a private equity fund actually wants to buy into. Start with self-service because it's the cheapest way into this business by a wide margin. A single bay fully equipped with a pressure washer, foaming brush system, coin or card payment terminal, and the required oil-water separator typically runs $20,000 to $70,000 to build out. Most operators won't open with fewer than 3 bays because 1 bay down for repair on a 1-bay site means 0 revenue that day. A modest 3-bay self-service wash lands somewhere around $60,000 to $210,000 in construction construction and equipment costs alone before land or lease. Add vacuums because self-service customers expect them. Industry guidance calls for roughly 1.5 vacuum stations per bay at $3,000 to $8,000 per unit. On a 3-bay site, that's another 4 to 6 vacuum stations, adding real money to the build, but also becoming one of the more reliable little revenue lines in the business, generating around $200 to $300 a month each on their own. Financing that equipment instead of buying it outright is common even at this small scale, since a few $1,000s a month in lease payments is far easier for a new owner to absorb than $70,000 in cash before a single quarter has dropped in the machine. Even at this end of the business, the cost isn't only the wash system. The oil-water separator required in almost every jurisdiction runs several $1,000s on its own, and site work, pouring concrete, running drainage, tying into the sewer line can quietly cost as much as the wash equipment itself if the lot wasn't previously built for anything similar. Now the in-bay automatic. The wash equipment itself, the rollover or touchless system, runs $150,000 to $300,000 for the machine alone. Once you add the enclosed bay structure, site work, and a payment kiosk, total investment for a single in-bay automatic typically lands between $400,000 and $1.2 million. That's 5 to 20 times the cost of a self-service bay, for a format that still only washes one car at a time. Most of that premium goes into the moving parts, the arms, rollers, and sensors that have to track a vehicle's exact shape and stop before touching a mirror or antenna. Mechanical complexity a self-service bay simply doesn't need since the customer is the one holding the wand. Then the express tunnel, and this is where the numbers change categories entirely. The conveyor system alone, the rollers, brushes, foam arches, and dryers, runs $1 to $3 million depending on length and specification, sourced from equipment manufacturers like Sonny's, Belanger, Pico, or Coleman. A 100-foot tunnel with a full package, foam arch, triple brush wrap, undercarriage wash, and a heated dryer system sits at the upper end of that range, while a shorter, simpler 80-foot layout can come in noticeably lower. Add the building, water reclamation system, vacuums, payment kiosks, and site work, and total cost to build a new express tunnel from the ground up runs anywhere from about $2 million on the low end to $5 or $6 million for a larger, high-specification location. Here's the decision that shows up at every level of this business, and it doesn't have one right answer. Finance the equipment or pay cash for it. Financing an in-bay machine or a tunnel system keeps more cash in reserve during the slow early months while the customer base builds, but the interest adds real cost over the life of the loan, and the payment doesn't care whether the wash is busy or empty that week. Paying cash avoids that fixed monthly obligation entirely, but it drains the exact reserve you need to survive the first year, when membership numbers and wash counts are still climbing toward whatever the site can actually support. Every one of the operators buying up the tunnel space over the last decade leaned toward debt to grow faster. As we'll see later in this video, that decision is also the one that eventually caught up with the largest name in the industry. Location works differently for each of these three, and getting it wrong doesn't just slow you down, it can make the entire format unworkable. Self-service needs population, not traffic. The rule of thumb in the industry is that it takes roughly 1,000 to 1,500 people in the surrounding area to support a single self-service bay. A town of 5,000 can support around 5 bays split between however many competitors are already there. What it does not need is a prime, expensive corner lot because customers are already planning to spend 5 or 10 minutes on site. A side street a block off the main road works fine, and the cheaper rent directly protects the thin margin this format runs on. The in-bay automatic goes the opposite direction. It rides on someone else's traffic. That's why the vast majority of them sit on a gas station lot or next to a convenience store, capturing customers who are already stopped for fuel. Standalone in-bay automatics without that host traffic tend to struggle because the format depends on impulse decisions from people who are already parked somewhere nearby, not on people driving specifically to get washed. The express tunnel needs the opposite of both. It wants a high-visibility corner lot on a road carrying real daily traffic, ideally with easy entry and exit in both directions because the entire model depends on volume. A single tunnel wash on the busiest corner of town can put through 200,000 cars a year at an established high-performance performing location. That same tunnel dropped on a quiet side street with the identical equipment inside might struggle to hit a tenth of that. The land under a tunnel costs more precisely because the model can't function without the traffic that expensive land sits on top of. Land prices make the gap between these three formats even wider. A quarter-acre lot suitable for a self-service wash on a side street might lease for a few $1,000s a month in most mid-sized markets. A prime corner lot large enough for a tunnel, with the frontage and turning radius the format needs, can run tens of thousands of dollars a month in a competitive metro area, or cost several $1,000,000 outright to purchase, which is exactly why so many tunnel operators lease the equipment and finance the real estate separately rather than owning both outright from day one. And here's the trap that catches all three formats in a different way. Cheap land is not the same thing as profitable land. A self-service wash on cheap land in a town too small to support even one bay will sit empty regardless of price. An in-bay automatic bolted onto a gas station with low fuel traffic inherits that low traffic. And a tunnel built on a discounted lot half a mile off the main corridor chasing a lower purchase price can end up with the same $2 to $6 million cost structure and a fraction of the volume that structure actually requires to break even. Self-service runs on almost nothing month to month, and that's the entire appeal. Water and sewer for a 3-bay site typically runs a few hundred to around $1,000 a month, and soap, wax, and tire cleaner concentrate add another modest line, usually a few $100s, since the customer is diluting and applying it themselves rather than a machine burning through chemical at a fixed rate. There's no payroll to speak of since most locations run completely unattended aside from occasional cleaning and coin collection. The trap here isn't a monthly bill, it's equipment failure. A broken pressure washer or a jammed payment terminal on an unmanned site can sit broken for days before anyone notices, and every day it's down is lost revenue on one of only 3 or 4 bays generating income in the first place. The in-bay automatic carries a different kind of risk. Labor stays low, often just someone stopping by periodically rather than a dedicated attendant, but the mechanical complexity is higher than a self-service bay, and repair costs reflect that. A single major component failure, a broken roller arm or a malfunctioning dryer system, can run into thousands of dollars. And because there's usually only one wash bay on site, any downtime means the location generates zero wash revenue until it's fixed. Water use per car is comparatively efficient, typically 10 to 50 gallons, but many jurisdictions still require a water reclamation system, adding real equipment cost most new owners don't budget for on day one. The express tunnel is where running costs stop being small numbers. Labor for greeters, attendants, and prep staff typically eats 25 to 35% of total revenue, the single largest line item in the business. Attendants typically earn $14 to $18 an hour, shift managers $18 to $25, and a location running from early morning through evening 7 days a week needs enough staff on the schedule to cover every one of those hours, whether the lot is packed or empty that particular afternoon. Utilities, mostly water and electricity for the tunnel motors and dryers, run another 10 to 15%, with water alone accounting for 5 to 10% even with a reclamation system in place, since tunnel washes use somewhere between 14 and 60 gallons per car. On top of that, tunnel equipment needs constant preventative maintenance, daily chemical checks, weekly conveyor lubrication, monthly full inspections, because a breakdown during a busy Saturday doesn't just cost a repair bill, it costs every membership wash and every full-price customer who would have come through that day. Weather cuts both ways for the tunnel specifically, and it's worth calling out on its own. A snowy winter in a cold weather market can be the single best season of the year for a membership-based tunnel, since salted, slush-covered cars create constant demand and members show up out of habit regardless of the temperature. But road salt is also brutal on conveyor components and undercarriage equipment, meaning the season that drives the most revenue is often the same season that drives the highest repair costs. A trade-off self-service and in-bay operators barely notice by comparison. There's a licensing and environmental layer that touches all three formats, but gets missed most often by first-time self-service and in-bay owners. Oil, grease, and road residue running off a wash bay is treated as industrial wastewater in most jurisdictions, which means an oil water separator isn't optional, and in many states, neither is a water reclamation system. Environmental permits alone can run $10,000 to $50,000 on top of standard building permits, and skipping this step doesn't just risk a fine, it can mean a shutdown order before the wash ever opens. This is where the three businesses stop looking anything alike. Start with self-service because the formula here is the simplest of the three. Take a 3-bay location with fixed monthly costs, rent, water, insurance, and equipment financing, adding up to around $3,000 a month. At an average ticket of $6 per wash cycle, that location needs about 500 washes a month, roughly 16 or 17 a day spread across 3 bays, just to cover its fixed costs. Anything above that number is close to pure margin, because the marginal cost of one more customer running the wand for 8 minutes is close to nothing. This is exactly why self-service, despite generating the lowest total revenue of the 3 formats, often produces the highest margins. There's almost no labor to eat into the difference between what a wash costs and what it sells for. The in-bay automatic runs a similar formula at a different scale. A location with fixed costs around $8,000 a month, covering equipment financing, minimal labor, utilities, and site lease, needs roughly 530 washes a month at a $15 average ticket to break even. That's about 18 cars a day through a single bay, which sounds manageable until you remember it's 1 car at a time, with a wash cycle that takes several minutes from entry to exit. Push past that daily number and the format runs into a hard physical ceiling long before it runs into a demand ceiling. There's only so many cars one bay can process in a day, no matter how many people want to wash. The express tunnel is the one where the formula actually has 2 separate parts, and understanding both is the whole point of this section. Part 1 is the traditional math. A tunnel with fixed monthly costs around $110,000, covering labor, utilities, equipment financing, rent, and insurance, needs roughly 5,500 washes a month at a $20 average ticket just to cover fixed costs. Spread across the month, that's close to 180 cars a day, which a well-run tunnel can handle without much trouble, given the format's whole design is built around throughput. Part 2 is the membership math, and this is the part that actually explains why tunnels have pulled in more private equity money than the other 2 formats combined. Say a location prices unlimited monthly membership at $25, right at the industry average. Each member visits roughly 2 to 3 times a month. At 2,000 active members, that's $50,000 in guaranteed monthly revenue before a single non-member customer ever pulls onto the lot, arriving on the first of the month, regardless of how many times any individual member actually shows up. One real example, an independently owned tunnel with about 1,000 active members was generating close to $315,000 a year from membership fees alone, on a location that needed only around 8 to 10 hours a week of owner oversight. Walk the arithmetic through once because it's worth hearing in order. $25 a month times 2,000 members equals $50,000 in guaranteed revenue before the parking lot even opens for the day. Compare that to the $110,000 in monthly fixed costs from part 1 of this formula, and membership revenue alone is already covering close to half the fixed cost of running the entire location, with every non-member wash on top of that going almost straight to the bottom line once the fixed costs are cleared. That's the appeal, and it's also the trap. A membership base converts a weather-dependent, foot traffic-dependent business into something closer to a subscription service, smoothing out the slow months and the rainy weeks that used to sink smaller operators. But it also means growth now depends on constantly adding new members faster than existing ones cancel, the exact churn dynamic that drives subscription businesses in every other category. And it means a huge share of monthly revenue is locked in at a price set months or years earlier, even as labor, water, and chemical costs rise around it. And membership cancellation works differently here than it does in a gym. There's no annual contract locking anyone in, no 30-day notice period, no penalty for walking away. A member cancels with a tap in an app, and the guaranteed revenue that number represented disappears the same month. That's precisely why the operators who scaled fastest kept building new locations to keep gross membership numbers climbing, even as the underlying churn quietly ate into the base at every existing site. The exact dynamic sitting underneath the case study coming up next. Across all 3 formats, there's one number that changes everything: how long it actually takes to reach that break-even line. Self-service and in-bay automatics, being simpler and cheaper to build, typically reach break-even within the first 6 to 12 months if the location was chosen correctly. The tunnel is a longer runway. Between the 18 months to 2 years it often takes to build a membership base large enough to cover a 6 or 7-figure fixed cost structure, and the $2 to $5 million already spent before the first car goes through, a tunnel owner is carrying real financial exposure for a lot longer than the other 2 formats, which is exactly the exposure that shows up in the next section. Here's what all of this looks like once real money and real debt get involved, and the story belongs almost entirely to the tunnel format, because that's the one built for scale, and scale scale is exactly what turned into the problem. Mr. Car Wash went public in 2021 at $15 a share, riding the same wave of private equity enthusiasm that had already pulled in firms like Golden Gate Capital, Oaktree, Warburg Pincus, and New Mountain Capital across the industry. At least 18 separate private equity platforms had bought into car wash roll-ups since 2014, all chasing the same math this video just walked through: recurring membership revenue, high margins, and a fragmented market ripe for consolidation. By the mid-2020s, Mr. Car Wash had grown past 520 locations, and membership subscriptions made up more than 75% of total revenue, exactly the recurring, weatherproof income stream the entire tunnel model is built to produce. On paper, that's the optimistic scenario playing out at full scale. In practice, the stock told a different story. Mr. Car Wash's valuation compressed from around 25 times earnings at its IPO down to roughly 7 or 8 times earnings within a few years, and the company was carrying close to $800 million in long-term net debt, much of it from financing acquisitions and new builds. By late 2025, cash on hand had fallen from $67 million to under $30 million in a single year. Roughly 80% of its locations had a competitor within 3 miles, a direct result of the same private equity money flooding into the format all at once, and building tunnels faster than local membership bases could actually absorb them. Analysts at Guggenheim described the wave of car wash bankruptcies and distressed sales happening across the industry at the same time as a healthy rationalization of what they called unacceptably high private equity-fueled capacity growth. In February 2026, Leonard Green, the firm that had already owned about 2/3 of the company, took Mr. Car Wash private at $7 a share, valuing the business at roughly $3.1 billion, including its debt, at about 9 times trailing earnings. Guggenheim's own note on the deal put it plainly: the public market simply hadn't embraced the conveyorized car wash model since the $15 IPO, and a company with real growing operations underneath it had still lost the confidence of the investors who'd priced it in the first place. Nobody stopped washing cars. The parking lot stayed full. The failure here wasn't demand, it was leverage laid on top of a format that takes years to pay back its own construction cost, in a market where every competitor was building the exact same asset on the exact same corner at the exact same time. Contrast that with what an individually owned, unleveraged tunnel can look like at a much smaller scale. One real listing for an 85-foot tunnel wash showed $700,000 in annual gross revenue and $160,000 in net profit, running on rent of under $9,000 a month and a payroll of 11 employees, including the owner. No debt-fueled acquisition spree, no public shareholders demanding growth every quarter, just a well-run location generating a genuinely solid income for one family. The lesson from putting these two cases side by side isn't that tunnels are dangerous and self-service is safe. It's that within the exact same format, the thing separating a comfortable 6-figure income from a billion-dollar restructuring is almost never the wash itself. It's how much debt got stacked on top of it and how fast. Self-service and in-bay automatics never produced a story like this. And that's not an accident either. Neither format needed millions of dollars in acquisition debt to grow, because neither one required buying up competitors to reach scale in the first place. Most self-service and in-bay locations in the country are still owned by individuals or small local groups, running 2, 3, sometimes a dozen sites, financed with a modest equipment loan rather than a leveraged buyout. It's a slower way to build wealth than a tunnel roll-up, and it will never produce a billion-dollar restructuring headline. It also never produces a billion-dollar restructuring risk. Let's put a full year on each of these 3 formats, starting with the optimistic version, where the location was chosen well and nothing unusual goes wrong. For self-service, Optimistic looks like a well-placed 3-bay location clearing around 18,000 washes a year at a $6 average ticket, plus steady vacuum income landing somewhere around $100,000 in annual revenue. With running costs this low, an owner can realistically keep 60 to 70% of that as profit, putting take-home somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000 a year for a business that might need only a few hours of attention a week. For the in-bay automatic, Optimistic means hitting that 18-car daily average consistently, landing around $200,000 in annual revenue at a $15 ticket. After equipment financing and modest labor, an owner might net somewhere between $50,000 and $80,000 a year, benefiting from a format that requires barely more oversight than the self-service bay, but generates meaningfully more revenue per square foot. For the express tunnel, Optimistic is the story Mr. Car Wash was built on before the debt caught up with it. A location that reaches 2,000 members within 18 months, layered with steady non-member traffic, can realistically generate $1.5 to $2 million in annual revenue. And at the 35 to 50% margins well-run tunnels can achieve, that's $500,000 or more in annual profit, before accounting for debt service on the $2 to $5 million it costs to build. Now, the realistic version, where 2 or 3 ordinary, unremarkable things go wrong at once, nothing catastrophic, just the normal friction every one of these businesses runs into. For self-service, realistic means a competitor opens 2 miles away and splits the local population base that was only ever large enough to support one location comfortably, while an aging pressure washer starts requiring repairs every few months instead of every year. Revenue can slide towards $70,000 or $80,000 a year, and profit margin compresses from that comfortable 60+% down toward 40 or 45%. Still a livable business, just a noticeably smaller one. For the in-bay automatic, realistic looks like slower than expected fuel traffic at the host gas station, combined with one major mechanical failure that takes the single bay offline for a week during a peak season. Annual revenue can land closer to $140,000 instead of $200,000, and with equipment financing payments staying fixed regardless of how many cars came through, owner take-home can shrink to $20,000 or $30,000. A very different outcome from the optimistic case, despite nothing about the underlying business actually failing. For the tunnel, realistic is the scenario playing out across the industry right now. Membership growth stalls around 1,200 instead of 2,000 because a second tunnel opened 3 miles away, offering a cheaper monthly plan. Exactly the kind of competitive overlap now affecting roughly 80% of the largest operators' locations. Add a tunnel motor failure that costs a weekend of lost revenue during a busy month, and annual revenue can land closer to $1 million instead of $2 million, with margins compressing toward 20% once debt service on the original build cost is factored in. Nothing here is a scandal, and the parking lot might still look reasonably full most afternoons. It's just membership growth that came in slower than the pitch deck promised, layered on top of debt payments that don't care how the month actually went. Line all 3 optimistic outcomes up against what it actually took to get there, and the picture gets more interesting. Self-service can return $60,000 to $70,000 a year on an investment that might total $150,000, a strong percentage return on a small number. The tunnel can return $500,000 a year, a far bigger number in absolute terms, but against $3 or $4 million invested and years spent waiting to get there. Neither percentage return makes the other one wrong. They're just different shapes of the same bet. One small and fast, one enormous and slow. And the realistic scenario is the reminder that the slow, enormous bet is also the one with the most room to go sideways before anyone notices. So this was never really 3 versions of the same simple idea. It was 3 completely different bets on the same 3 ingredients: water, land, and time. Self-service bets almost nothing and asks for almost nothing back. The in-bay automatic bets on someone else's traffic and hopes it's enough. The express tunnel bets everything: land, equipment, years of build-out, on convincing thousands of people to keep paying whether they show up or not. And that bet only pays off if growth outruns the debt taken on to chase it. None of these 3 is the safe one, and none of them is the reckless one. What separates a car wash that quietly pays for itself from one that ends up as a $3 billion restructuring headline was never the machinery inside it. It's the leverage stacked on top and how patient the money behind it is willing to be. If you were choosing one of these 3 to actually put your own money into, which one would it be and why? Drop it in the comments. I'm curious how many of you land on the boring one. If this laid out numbers you'd never actually seen broken down before, a like helps more than you'd think. And if you want the same breakdown for another business people think they understand, subscribe. Every week, one more business that looks simpler from the outside than it actually is.